Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here. I'm looking forward to a set of very interesting discussions amongst all of us, and hopefully providing for the broader audience, both here in the room and elsewhere, a better understanding of what we do and obviously what we don't know, since science is by design and should be somewhat messy. We always know some things and still need to know more. I'm going to give you a brief historical perspective. So, I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I understand how this works. I'm hitting the... Okay. So we've known for some time that high levels of exposure to particulate matter and the larger mixture, we're talking greater than 500 micrograms per cubic meter, are known to cause premature death. What started a lot of the current debate is in the 1990s, some new short-term studies and then a couple of long-term studies came forward that were suggesting associations of premature mortality with exposure at much lower levels, lower than 50 micrograms per cubic meter. And my institution, HEI, and others have done a substantial amount of work since then to try and test and extend these short-term and long-term results. This is not a new problem on one level, although we should be lucky that we're not living in 18th century London when this quote was made, or in mid-20th century settings where we had very, very serious high levels of pollution and fairly well-determined increases in mortality in the 1930s in the Meuse Valley, in 1948 in Donora, Pennsylvania, and probably best known in 1952 in the so-called fog of London. Those events set off a series of research activities over the last 50, really almost 60 years now, of varying levels of sophistication, improving levels of monitoring of air pollution, improving statistical analyses, and leading us to where the kinds of studies that we're going to talk about a lot today. In the 1990s, we saw first a series of new studies of individual cities, tracking daily changes in air pollution with daily changes in health, mortality, or other markers of health like hospitalization. These are so-called time series studies, and you're going to hear that term a lot during the day. There were some 40 studies in Europe and the U.S. They showed a relatively consistent small increase in mortality and hospitalization, something like 0.5% increase to 1% increase per 10 micrograms per cubic meter. And for those of you who are less familiar with these kinds of graphs, I wanted to spend just a second in this first one to illustrate, because you're going to see a lot of these during the day, and some of them are going to be vertical and some of them are going to be horizontal. But the concept is, I'm sorry, my mouse is not working, but the concept is that in this case, the vertical line would represent no effect in the particular city being studied. The small dot to the right or left of that line would indicate, if it's to the right, it would indicate an estimate of an increased association of mortality. And the two lines that bracket each dot are the 95% confidence interval, so that statistically there's reasonably a reasonable certainty that these results are within 95% of the true result, although that certainly we'll have questions and issues about that. So you're going to see a lot of these kinds of slides, and that's roughly what each one of them will show. There were significant questions about these studies, I'll just use the pointer. Significant questions about the studies, most notably, how were these cities selected, and were there some where analyses were done, but no effect was seen, so they didn't get their way into the published literature, so-called publication bias. One response to that was a set of systematic multi-city studies that were done. The first one was in Europe, funded by the European Union, called the AFEA study. HEI funded investigators at Johns Hopkins to conduct the National Morbidity, Mortality, and Air Pollution Study, or NMAPS. Then most recently, we actually, with joint funding between HEI and the European Union, brought together the investigators for both of the earlier sets as well as Canadian investigators to conduct what we call the Athena study, and those results were published late last year. So NMAPS, which covered 90 cities in the United States, was originally reported in 2000 about a 0.4% increase per 10 micrograms of PM10. These were smaller results than the previous studies, suggesting that perhaps there were studies now being included that had been left out of earlier analyses, although overall our review committee, intensive peer review committee, found an enhanced confidence in the results as a result of this. In 2002, investigators at Hopkins as well as at Health Canada realized that the statistics used in these studies had some serious problems, and that caused a revised set of analyses for over 30 such studies that EPA identified and which were subjected to a separate review by an expert panel of the Health Effects Institute. Most of the estimates of effects for these studies actually went down, although our review panel felt, bottom line, that the effects were still positive even when controlling for other pollutants, but revised analyses, these revised analyses also raised some new questions, and there was a need for continuous improvement. And quickly to point out, so 0.4% was the result in the original NMAPS, about 0.2%, but still relatively statistically significant, was the result in the new revised one. One of the things that the NMAPS investigators always did is presented the full set, all the 90 cities, and what you'll see here is a large number here. Remember, that line is now horizontal, but it's the same kind of concept. A large number of cities, and those cities are, for the most part, showing positive estimates of effect, but the 95% confidence intervals do, for them, in most cases, extend below that line because of the small number of days that were available for each of those cities. The most consistent results were actually in Southern California and in the Northeast, with the Northeast having somewhat higher results. And part of the analysis showed that there were also statistically significant pooled results in the industrial Midwest.